Hi, and welcome to the all-new TV version of the Glenn and Helen Show. I'm Glenn, and this is Helen.
Hey.
Joining us from Washington, D.C. via the globe-girdling Pajamas Television Network, also known as the Internet, is Governor Mike Huckabee. He's a rock star. He has his own new TV show as well. And, well, there's even more.
He's got a new book out entitled Do the Right Thing. We're going to talk to him today about what will bring Republicans and right-leaning Americans together or split them apart in the coming years. Hi, Governor.
Hello, Helen. How are you? It's good to be with you and Glenn again. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much for being here. So, Governor,
I
read your...
making me wear pajamas, by the way, Helen, during the interview.
Oh,
I know that it's
you know,
PJTV.
we didn't even think of that, but now that you mention it, we'll do that to our next guest.
Yeah, I just don't look that good in a teddy. You just don't want me there. So thank you very much for not asking me.
Well, now you've got the image in my mind. Okay. So I read your book. Both of us did, and there's a whole chapter in there attacking what you call faux conservatives who like the Club for Growth or the Cato Institute. You know, libertarians like Glenn or I. You call libertarians worse than liberals. Are we that bad?
No. In fact, I don't attack libertarians for being worse than liberals. What I say is that when libertarians say that they are more conservative than traditional Republicans, then that's when it becomes worse than liberals. Because there is sort of a growing, I guess, maybe branch or whatever within the Republican Party who don't want to hear anything about some of the, let's say, traditional values issues. They say those are not important. We shouldn't be talking about those. We only want to talk about cutting taxes and reducing government. But the truth is, we can't reduce government and cut taxes without also understanding that a lot of the cost of government is directly related to the breakdown of family and individual responsibility. So if we, just say we're going to arbitrarily cut things, how many police do we take off the streets? How many people do we let out of prison beds? The point is, if we focus on both the cutting of taxes, the fiscal issues, as well as personal responsibility, families growing up, building kids of character, then you don't have as many people that you have to put in jail. You don't have as many drug and alcohol counselors. And so my point about the faux cons is that I think that there is a real need to realize that these are not incompatible goals. Frankly, most value conservatives I know are also fiscal conservatives. But there are some who are strictly economic conservatives who are social liberals, who believe in legalized drugs, who don't want to talk about anything such as the sanctity of life or traditional marriage. That's where I think the discussion has to happen.
Well, I think that doesn't necessarily conflict, although I certainly got the impression in your book that it does. But, it's Bill Bennett, I think, is the one who likes to say culture is more important than politics. And a lot of the things you're talking about are things that are really dealt with more through culture than through the hand of the state. And it's actually interesting. Our daughter, for example, is... Oh, okay. Our daughter is actually pretty conservative in her views, but she's very libertarian in terms of her views of what the law should do. And I think actually a lot of her friends seem to be that way. Maybe it's a generational thing.
The difference is this. Let me be very clear. I don't want the government raising our kids. In fact, if you've read the book, you know that one of the major principles of conservatism that I tout is that mothers and fathers raise better kids than governments do. It's precisely the point that the best government is not the government we elect. The best government, in fact, go back to the very second chapter, the very most important thing is the best government of all is self-government. That's what we really should shoot for. And if we have good self-government, which means I govern myself according to a moral code and principles that say that some things are right and some things are wrong, then I don't need a lot of civil government restricting, requiring, and regulating me. And in a perfect world, we would have almost no government at all except to protect our borders and to make sure that we had a national defense, maybe a road system. Other than that, we would govern ourselves. We would care for our own families. We wouldn't have a bunch of government that would tell us what to do, how fast to drive, where to walk. We wouldn't need it. But because some people don't want to live within what ought to be the basic rules of do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, that's where we create government. I was a governor 10.5 years. My experience was that of the 353 boards, agencies, and commissions that we had in my state, most every one of them were created as a result of someone in a business trying to bend or break rules that really should have never had to be written down and codified into law. But once those unethical practices started, the good guys wanted to create a board to regulate the bad guys. And that gets expensive. And that's why government is so darn expensive today.
But don't you think we'd be better off letting communities and parents do that job? I think when it's coming from the government, it makes it a little bit, I don't know how well that actually works.
Well, I do think it's better. In fact, that's exactly what I'm saying. The whole chapter of the best government is self-government is that government ought to start in the individual. The next level of government is the family. The next level of government should be the broader family. The next is the neighborhood, then the community. The last resort of any type of intervention ought to be the federal government. What bothers me about such things as the federal bailout of all these industries is that we're now looking at the federal government as the court of first resort, not the court of last resort. And I think it's a huge mistake. We ought to be teaching people to be individualist. We ought to be teaching them to be personally responsible for their own behavior. I mean, I think about it in my lifetime. When I was a little kid, when people got old, their families figured out how to take care of them. Today, when people get old, we figure how quickly can we get them into the government system of either Medicare or Medicaid so they no longer represent a financial burden to the family. I understand the complexity of these issues. I went through the whole process of elderly parents myself, both of whom are deceased. But my sister and I never took the position that we ought to deplete their net worth as quickly as possible so that we could make them wards of the state and get them into Medicaid. It was our goal to see that we tried to manage, particularly like my mother who outlived my father, manage her affairs so that she would never become a burden on the taxpayers and she would never have to live off of somebody else's funding. And down to the point of selling the last asset she had, which was her house. And frankly, we were about 13 months away from her depleting every last dime that she and my dad had ever saved.
Well, let's actually move to a slightly broader question that really goes with this, which is in the aftermath of the election, we've actually seen a certain amount of infighting, and we've seen some people, as you mentioned, saying, oh, what the Republicans should do is get rid of the social conservatives. That's what's dragging them down. We've seen some of the social conservatives say we need to get rid of the libertarians. That's what's dragging them down, and so on. I guess my question is, at this point, especially given that it just took a beating, is the GOP in a position to start kicking out anybody from the big tent? I mean, doesn't it need to make the tent bigger, not smaller?
Sure. I think it's a matter, we can't lose the social conservatives because then you have no capacity to win an election. The social conservatives are the foot soldiers. They're the ones who will go out there and make the phone calls, manning the phone banks. They're the ones who will knock on doors and put up signs and man things out there at the county fairs and pass out literature and have a lot of passion. They're also the ones that really would perhaps be able to just stay home or go independent or vote Democrat if the Republicans don't stand for issues that to them are not political issues but moral issues. Where we really need to have a respect is that there needs to be a greater respect among the economic conservatives, whether they are hardcore libertarian or whether they're simply what I would call maybe more Rockefeller Republicans. The Rockefeller Republicans being those who want to make sure that we take good care of Wall Street, but don't really care that much about what happens out there in the middle of America, and perhaps don't want to ever be confronted with issues like the sanctity of life, the Second Amendment, or bothersome topics to them like that. It's just strictly a matter of economic policies. One of the problems I think the Republicans face is the Republican current economic policies are not even Republican policies. You can't call them Republican when we're talking about bailing out private sector businesses with public money, with spending that indebts us for generations to come, not even attempting to balance the budget, really a ridiculous attitude toward taxes, which is we'll politically not raise them, but we will force future generations to raise them by borrowing so much money that our grandchildren will have to figure out how to pay for this, and not reforming the most expensive programs in government like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security.
Well, I think that's right, although I would say the understanding kind of needs to go both ways. That is to say, maybe it's because I live in Tennessee, maybe it's because I've been involved in issues like gun rights that bring together a big tent, but, I'm a libertarian. I'm a law professor. A lot of people like that are scared off by social conservatives, but I know a lot of religious conservatives. They're very nice people. Nobody who knew them would really be scared of them. At the same time, I remember in the debates, I remember you and John McCain acting as if profits are a dirty word. And, I think that we can't have Republicans without recognizing that businesses making profits are what give us the money to do all the stuff we need to do, and that free enterprise is freedom itself. Now, I think you're right to distinguish that from sort of state corporatism, which is what you get with the bailouts. But I think do you think that's a message that the Republicans need to refine a little more?
Well, Glenn, let me first of all clear up whatever misperception you may have of my position. I don't think profits are bad. I think profits are wonderful. I think companies go into business to make profits, whether they're small business or big business. I think they ought to make all the profit they can. They ought to can all they get, and they ought to sit on the can. The profits aren't what's the problem. The only thing that I spoke to was the fact that you had in some companies CEOs who had driven their companies not to profits but to poverty, and then took even more money when they left with a golden parachute. Now that is a moral issue. When people at the top ruin their companies and then walk away with hundreds of millions of dollars in bonuses as if they'd done something wonderful, when in fact they did something horrible. If the CEO of a company is leading that company to profitability, pay him well, hang on to him, whatever it costs. But when that CEO starts bankrupting the company and running it into the ground, then you shouldn't reward him with a big fat bonus check while the people at the bottom are walking away with nothing. And that's the only thing I ever said. In fact, I even went a step further. This is another thing. I've been accused of being against CEO salaries and even against private sector and wanting to have the government regulate CEO salaries. I never said that. Anyone who says I did misrepresented my position, because what I think is the worst thing that could happen is for government to set the CEO salaries. What I do call for is for corporate boards to show some responsibility and quit cross-pollinating their boards with each other's members, so one guy does a favor for his pal who does a favor for him. They both get ridiculous bonuses, but they've mismanaged their companies. When the companies are well managed and they're profitable, hats off and gloves off and ceiling off. But when they're running their companies in the ground, the board ought to be firing their rear ends, not giving them a big paycheck.
No argument there.
Let's turn to economic policy, something you've been talking about. You're a big proponent of the fair tax.
Right.
And isn't that something that libertarians and conservatives can agree on? First, could you describe to our viewers what the fair tax is and answer that question, please?
Well, I think it's a point not only that libertarians and conservatives or Republicans could agree on. I think it's something that if Democrats ever fully understood it, they jump all over this thing. Because there's really no one who doesn't benefit, whether you're at the bottom of the economic spectrum or the top. And the fair tax, in a simple word, is replacing all of the current penalties on our productivity. We tax everything that produces. We tax income, whether it's corporate or individual. We tax investments. We tax savings. We tax inheritance. We tax capital gains, which is simply a way of saying we've done well, we ought to be congratulated. Instead, we're penalized. On the other hand, we subsidize irresponsible and reckless behavior. So when you penalize something, you get less of it. When you reward something, you get more of it. What we do, we're penalizing what we ought to be getting more of, which is productivity and work. What we're subsidizing is we're subsidizing reckless irresponsibility, and that's why we're getting more of it. The fair tax taxes us at the point of consumption at the retail level. It eliminates every other tax on our productivity. No more income tax, whether it's corporate or individual. No more tax on savings, investments, inheritance, capital gains. No more payroll taxes taken out of our checks. We'd eliminate the IRS. No more compliance with these extraordinarily complex tax laws that nobody, including the IRS, understands, some 66,000 pages of them. And what you have is a very simple consumption tax that has an immediate economic impact on the country in at least a couple of ways. Well, let me list three real quickly. There are a lot more, but these three I think are important. First, you bring capital back to the U.S. Currently, $13 trillion of U.S. capital is parked offshore because businesses can't afford to leave their working money in the United States because of the onerous tax laws. So instead of bailing out a handful of industry, bring $13 trillion back to the U.S. economy. Second thing it does, it ends the underground economy. You don't have people who are skirting the law but doing it on a cash basis. So now the lawbreakers become taxpayers. What a novel idea. And a third thing it does, it ends the incredibly expensive compliance issue. This is especially tough on small businesses. It's been estimated that between $250 and $500 billion are spent just to comply with the tax law. So how much more would that be productive if people were making business decisions rather than tax code decisions? It would free up free enterprise in a way, make us competitive. Manufacturing, even in Detroit, could likely be profitable again, but our basic economic problem in this country is not cyclical as it typically has been in the past in terms of economics. Our problem is structural. We're in a very different kind of economy. It's more of a true global economy, and we can't run the old model and expect to have great results. So if we don't make some real structural changes in the tax code, which I think means jettisoning the current one and implementing a consumption tax in its place, I don't see us really coming out of this economic slump other than we'll come out of it in spurts, but we're going to have a long-term problem because we've really not addressed what's hurting us the most.
Well, what would bureaucrats do for jobs?
Well, they do what the rest of us do. They go out and get one in the private sector. You know, it's absurd when you think that government is becoming the only stable employer in our culture. And what makes that crazy is that government can only be financed by taking money out of the profitability of those who actually create real jobs, who do real services, and who produce real products. What we've ended up with is a world filled where the government continues to grow, and there's not going to be enough private sector businesses who can afford to pay enough to function and basically feed the government's insatiable appetite. At some point, that causes an internal collapse. I read an interesting book a number of years ago, Why Democracies Perish. Interestingly, wasn't written by some radical right-winger. It was written by a French communist by the name of Jean-Francois Revel. And in the book, Why Democracies Perish, the essence is this: democracies perish once people inside those systems realize that they can vote for themselves privileges and pleasures out of the public treasury. Once they start doing that, they're going to realize that somebody else's work and somebody else's productivity can fund their own personal largesse. And when enough people make withdrawals, but fewer and fewer people are making deposits, you don't have to fire shots from without because the system collapses from within. And it's a very fascinating book. And again, it's written from the perspective not of somebody who is embracing our system and talking about how wonderful it is, but somebody who basically says it ought to collapse, but it's going to anyway, so don't worry. Stand back and let these capitalists destroy themselves when they start realizing that they can get free money from their government. Only thing is there's no such thing as free money because somebody had to put it in there. That's really the problem we face.
That's absolutely right. And, you know, another book on this subject that I really like is Mansur Olson's book, The Rise and Decline of Nations, which makes a similar point that, you know, as democracies exist, they get this web of special interests that ties everything up and makes everything more efficient or more inefficient and more expensive until it eventually grinds to a halt. And only a war or catastrophe tends to interrupt that. He thought maybe the United States was different and had a capacity for self-renewal that other democracies have lacked. And, well, I hope he's right. We're running out of time, well, but we did actually ask readers, I'm sorry, we asked readers for a few questions, and if you wouldn't mind answering a couple that we got from email, that would be nice. Reader Ed Faulkner writes, define what it means to be a conservative and state why anyone should vote for someone who is conservative.
What it means to be a conservative is that you want to conserve the best of that which has given you strength, which means strong borders, national security, but then it means that you essentially let families raise their own kids and don't mess with them. A conservative is not interested in being more involved in government. A conservative is interested in having less involvement with the government, but not needing so much government because he's being responsible himself. That means it's not required to take more money out of his pocket and paycheck, because he's not asking for a lot. It also means leaving him the heck alone. Let him pick his kids' schools. Let him decide where he wants to work and worship, what he wants to say and what he doesn't want to say. It means that we should have taxes that are as low as possible, primarily based on low tax rates, because if you have low tax rates, you have an expanded tax base, more people paying less in per person, and that's better than a few people paying in a whole lot because then you have a complete mismatch of those who are the producers and those who are the consumers. And so that's in a nutshell. I mean, there are, I think, a lot of other aspects to it, but that's kind of the high points, if you will, for me.
Okay. Here's another question from reader D. Wyman. I would like some question about economic populism versus free market views. The suspicion is that Mike veers in the direction of the former rather than the latter, and I'd like to hear how he frames the issue in his own mind. So how do you?
You know, throughout the campaign, it was interesting. I was called a populist, and when I would ask people, what do you mean by that? I bet there wasn't 1 in 100 people who could ever tell me what that meant, other than I think what many people thought it meant was that I spoke as if I was speaking for ordinary common people, the baggage handlers, the flight attendants, the cab drivers, the hotel clerks and porters, which I hope I was. Does that mean that I think that we ought to, you know, go get the big guy? Of course not. It's not what I mean at all. But I mean that there ought to be policies that reflect the best for everybody. The reason that I'm a strong supporter of the fair tax is because everybody pays into the system, but only proportionally to what he or she spends. So you don't have people who are buying Learjets escaping a tax code, but at the same time, you don't have people, you know, down at the middle or the bottom who are completely escaping some type of responsibility, even though the provision of the prebate within the fair tax does untax the basic necessities of people, so therefore everybody has some pretty firm footing to get started on.
Well, thank you. And one final question from a reader. Reader Kent Budge writes, ask him if he could ever vote for an active Mormon for president. Well, could you?
Absolutely. Of course I could. I would vote for a person if it was a rank atheist, if I thought they would govern well. You know, I don't have a religious litmus test for anyone running. Some of my role models is, to me, great public servants. Mike Leavitt, who is a good friend of mine, Secretary of Health and Human Services, longtime governor of Utah. John Huntsman, current governor of Utah, is a terrific leader and stalwart. I could vote for him. I could vote for probably Orrin Hatch. I appreciate his staunch judicial views and his conservative approach to the bench. Where this idea came from that I somehow wouldn't vote for a person who wasn't of my faith, or more specifically, wouldn't vote for a Mormon, is nonsense. Utter, total nonsense, created by people who tried to drive a wedge between me and maybe people who were Mormon. But that's nonsense. In fact, I've been one of the people that went on national television just a week ago praising the Mormon Church for the strong participation and funding on the Proposition 8 ballot question in California, because they had the courage of their convictions and they put cash behind it. And now they're under extraordinary persecution from some activists out there. And I'm standing with the Mormons saying, God bless them, and, you know, thank you for having the courage to not only say something, but to do something and put your money behind it.
You know, it's interesting. There's no question that there is some bad blood between the Mormons and some Christians. And I wonder, to the extent that the whole Prop 8 blowback has, in fact, brought some people together. I guess we'll have to stay tuned on that.
Before we go, do you have any final thoughts?
I never thought we were apart as far as I was concerned. I don't think that a person ought to be judged for fitness for public service based on what they believe and where they go to church on Sunday. The only thing I believe is that if where you go to church on Sunday affects you, then let me know what that is. But the only problem I ever have is a person who goes to a church or synagogue, whatever it may be, but doesn't really ever allow it to apply to his life. To me, the issue isn't religion, the issue is phoniness. So I just want people to be consistent. I've said publicly, and I know this sounds like a heretical statement, I said I have a lot more respect for Pete Stark, who's a liberal congressman from California who is an open atheist, declares openly he's an atheist. I said, you know what, I respect him because you know what you're getting. He's honest and above board. I have more respect for him than I do somebody who claims to be a Bible-carrying Christian, but who never lives like it. Those are the people who bother and scare me the most.
Well, thank you. That's very good to hear.
Do you have any final thoughts for our viewers about what they should be doing politically, especially those of us who are bloggers and are interested in politics, to help out the conservative cause?
Well, I think that there needs to be a more sense of really developing some intellectual depth to our thoughts. I'm afraid the conservative cause is easily reduced to a bunch of shouting slogans and bumper strips. Not that our message doesn't lend itself to some great slogans and some wonderful bumper strips. But I want to be able for us to understand that if we're true conservatives, we can intellectually defend that, and we can carry those views to their logical conclusion and live with the results. I don't think that's true of liberals. And what has been so frustrating to me, and one of the things I hope to clear up in this book, people who have said that I was a social conservative but an economic liberal, I challenge them to tell me where. I challenge them to show me in what way have I been a liberal in anything. I think my conservatism has been consistent. I hope people will read this book, because I think they won't agree with all of it, and some of it may even make them mad. But if it makes them think and even come to grips with their own thoughts and processes, then that's good, because I think the conservative movement with true conservatives can always handle whatever pressure and maybe honest intellectual curiosity that it has thrown against it. It's when we sidestep the arguments and we refuse to defend what I would consider the intellectual points of our doctrine that we need to be concerned.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's Mike Huckabee, rock and roll star, Fox TV host, and author of Do the Right Thing, which is available in the Pajamas Media Amazon A store, on Amazon.com, and wherever fine books are sold. Thanks again for taking time to join us.
Thank you.